resume, it should be.
I think that introduction was proof I can't hold down a job. I don't know why we come up with such punishing organizational names. I applaud your ability to get through those. What's red and hurts your teeth? A brick. My point is that relative to the presentations you've seen today, things are going to go a little downhill. So when I was offered the opportunity, and I really appreciate that you had me in, and I appreciate that you stuck around to the end of the day. Huge amount of experience in the room. Like when I added up your 10, 15, and 20-year lists, I came up with over 1,000 years right there. Maybe there's about 800 left, eh? But I really appreciate you inviting me. And when I was invited to do it, I was with Forest Management Branch. Now I'm in this resource integration planning branch, and our purview is a little bit bigger, right? We're into energy, municipal expansion, water, air, biodiversity, land. It's a pretty complex landscape. And when I wake up in the middle of the night screaming that I changed jobs, I go back to what I know. I go back to what's simple for me and what's accessible. And so some of this, what I'm going to present, it's going to be old hat for you. Dave, Ian, Bill, this is going to feel pretty simplistic relative to what you've seen today. But I hope it's at least a different way of looking at something that you live every day, and it makes you very valuable in integrated resource planning wherever you go. Does anyone deal with GIS, like use ArcMap or anything like that? Do you know the very first license for that product was sold to the Department of Natural Resources in New Brunswick back in like 1980 or so? And the second one was sold to J.D. Irving, a big forestry company out east. And some of the software that we use, like I don't know if any of you folks interact with Woodstock or Patchworks, that software was invented for forestry, but it's now used every day in the energy sector and in transportation. The problems we've been dealing with for 30 and 40 years are now everybody's problems. And the tools we've developed are what drive a lot of the approaches we're taking today with those bigger plans. So my point, is it part of your resume? It should be, because you live it. And some of my approach today is to take those basic things and talk about ways that we can kind of abstract them, think about them in their simplest terms, and maybe it gives us a tool for how we approach the broader problem. Just because I know our department, like I have to spend time memorizing it and rehearsing my title in a mirror because it's getting pretty complicated, I thought maybe you'd want to see how we're organized now. So ESRD is broken up into several divisions. For some of you, you might interact with folks in Forest Management Branch or what's now operations. So we're that group, Integrated Resource Management Planning. So I just think planning. Under that, the Land Use Framework is a notable branch. And then the branch beside that is where I am. It's Resource Integration Planning. I find it hard to think about what that means, but sub-regional planning, that's what I focus on. And some of the projects we're working on right now, I mean, obviously land use framework plans are still getting up to speed and identifying what the sub-regional plans are that's still happening. But some of the stuff that we are responsible for. Which one is my leg?
Yeah.
Cool. The implementation of regional plans. So if the regional plan says, hey, we're going to do an access management plan, that falls to us. WPACs, that's also, we're the department lead on those. Management response plans. So let's say in a particular region, you exceed an air threshold relative or an air limit. That's happened. So preparing response plans to that's also our group. Lucky me. Thank you, Christy. Water management plans, and then under species at risk, the caribou plans that the province is slowly progressing through, that's also out of our branch. One thing I won't talk about today, so this is a picture of an example of stand retention. There's a lot of practices that we do on the ground at the site where we're integrating other values, and I'm not going to talk about what we do sort of at that small stand level. I'm going to talk more broadly about what we do across the forest. But this is still an important part of how forestry integrates values into their day-to-day practices. So like I said, I like to get down to what's simple. So I'm going to talk about a very, very simple forest. A forest with 4 stands, which I've numbered for you. And on those stands, we have volumes. So this stand, I'll call it the number 1 stand, has 20 cubic meters. This one has 210. Okay, 110 and 170. Very, very simple. And if I harvest that stand, that whole forest, I just mow it down and I take what's there, I'll end up with 510 cubic meters, right? Pretty basic, pretty simple. And maybe not that great a solution, right? Maybe that's a forest from which you want to derive value over a longer term. So let's look at it now, but let's also look at it over the next 15 years. So here I've got it, the stand has 20 cubic meters now. This is the same forest, but in 5 years it's going to have 50. In 10 years it's going to have 80. In 15 years it's going to have 120. Okay, there we go. So it's growing. You can see that there are other stands that are declining. We need to kind of figure out what's a tractable strategy for dealing with this forest. So strategy number 1 is we're going to cut the highest yielding stand in each period. At that point, I need a volunteer. I'm going to pick on Barb, because I know Barb. Barb's my friend, or at least she used to be, right? Okay, Barb, your job is to implement that strategy. So as an example, in that first period, at time 0, which stand of these 4 has the most volume?
Number 2.
Cool. And in year 5?
Number 4.
Okay, and in year 10?
Number 4.
Oh, you already harvested that one.
It's gone.
It's gone.
Number 2. Oh, we already harvested that one too.
Yeah.
It's gone. And
Complicated.
what's left?
Huh? Yeah. Then we're down to this one. Okay, cool. You don't get to sit down. So that was a strategy, right? And Barb figured it out, and there's a little bit of complexity there, but pretty straightforward. And what she gets for that is she gets 620 cubic meters over that 20-year period. Second one. Okay. So strategy number 2, we're going to try something a little different. We're going to try and boost it up because our volumes are kind of all over the place, eh? Back there, right? 210 to 190 to 100 to 120. If we want some kind of consistent supply of value, that's not so good for us. So we're going to try harvesting each stand so that we're harvesting it when it's got the most volume. So, for example, that first stand, it's got 20 now, it's got 50 in 5 years. When is it going to have its most volume?
In 15 years.
Boom. So we'll cut that one then. So that second one, it's got 210 now and 180 and so on.
In 0 years.
Harvest it right away. And the one that's got 110?
Is 5 years.
Then we get this one. So we did a little bit better. We got a little bit more volume this time. We're up to 680. But at year 10, we're going to shut down the mill and say, okay, guys, just hold steady. Wait 5 years till we have some more wood come in. So we need something that does a little better than that. So now I'm going to make it easy on you. Okay. You can split the stands up. You can harvest a little bit as you need to so that you always get the same amount of volume in each 5-year period. Go for it. It's complicated, right? I mean, even with this little tiny simple forest, this is a complicated problem. So I even had to run a model when I made this slide a long time ago to kind of figure it out. And we did a little bit better, right? We managed to get that volume consistent across periods. Kind of ended up with 660. Not bad. Thank you so much. Very obliged. So like I said, very, very simple. But there's a point, okay? We're going somewhere. There were 3 main things about this example. What the forest looked like to start with. What did we have when we left out of the gate? How did those stands change over time? And then when we did something to them. There are other values, of course, besides timber. There are other things looking at that forest and putting on a different pair of glasses, if you like, and determining that there's other value there. And there's a few ways that we approach that in forest management planning. One of them is I'll call it an area approach. So we might know right now that there is a zone, and that zone is of special interest to a specific species now, and we can identify it on a map. And it's always going to be in the same place. This solution obviously changes for us. And there's lots of spatial complexity we can introduce like that, right? It might be an area of special habitat. It might be a riparian buffer. Maybe from like Michaela's previous presentation, maybe it's an area that's been identified through remote sensing as having dieback. Possibly it's some kind of point location. These are all things that as we integrate them into that problem, it's getting more and more and more complicated. One way we deal with that is we make a new map, right? All those things that we can map, we know that are statically in one place right now. You get maps for them, and digitally, we smoosh them into one big map. This one allows us to capture a new set of values. We've got our, I'll call them typical forest values that we might get from an ADI, but then we've got others. We can say for, let's say, this polygon, that it's also not in a riparian buffer. It's not something that's on a high slope thing, and therefore we can't harvest it. It's not in a protected area. Maybe it is in a grizzly bear special management zone. It's not under disposition. So we can now start attaching to a GIS, figuring out what our starting landscape is, a whole pile of different values. There's a second approach because, you know, things change over time. So let's say we have some kind of species that really likes old forest. Where that old forest is on the landscape, it changes over time. And if we're focused on figuring out that long-term solution for what we can get for wood, we've got to have some way to figure out how it hops around. There are other things we can attach to that polygon. So, I mean, in my example, we just had volume. So we could have volume. We could have things like habitat. You notice I've used these numbers 0 and 1. It's just my way of saying 1 is turned on and 0 is turned off. Piece size, the amount of coarse woody debris. These are other things we can forecast through time to understand how our forest is changing. How do we do that? Well, some of you probably somewhere in your career have been out collecting data on trees. And that data, it's not just volumes you're getting a bunch of other attributes that folks, smart people, can take and turn into other models for other creatures, models for other values. There's a tremendous amount of value in that work. So that just in the same way we can model volume as a function of age, we can do things like, and I just made this number up, okay? But we can say that it's not caribou habitat, it's not caribou habitat at age 80, boom, it's caribou habitat, and it stays that way for a while, and then it stops. So that we end up with these yield curves, these sort of forecasts of how things are going to change through time. The next thing, of course, we want to know is what that's worth to us. And that's where something like a model comes in, right? So just like with that forest stand example, it seemed pretty trivial, and yet, you know, we all knew we could do it, but it was pretty complicated to figure out. A model is like a giant calculator. You stick in your beginning landscape at the beginning, right? You add in your yield curve, and then over time, what you can do is figure out, my caribou habitat is, you know, does this stand count as caribou habitat right now, according to that yield curve? Is it not? How much of that area have I got from my map? And so you end up with that output. That output's important, right? It's like a handle on things. So, you know, some people like to use a black box. I like to use a meat grinder. If that's your model, if you're putting in things like stand volume and other habitat values, what you're getting out is something you can start to assess and start to deal with. In our simple example, it was harvest volume, but it can be other things like area of caribou habitat. Now that you know those things, you can manage them. So, going back to that example, if we take that solution that we came up with, and we just toss in, oh, by the way, you got to protect this thing, and oh, there's this thing that moves around over time, you got to protect that too. If we don't change, the only thing I can tell you for sure is that's not our solution. We're not going to get that volume, right? We're not adapting to it. On the other hand, if we just take our solution for granted and say, well, we're going to go ahead with this harvest sequence, and we'll just see what we get for these values, we don't know what we're going to get. And if those values are important to society, then we're failing. My very simple definition, which I'm taking liberally from Gordon Baskerville, who passed away this year, is that planning is pretty simple, right? We're trying to figure out what we're going to do to that forest in order to make it look a certain way, in order to see if we get the values that society cares about. In my example, these were our actions. These are the things we're doing to the forest, and that's going to make the forest look a certain way. Things that we can measure using sort of essentially attributes without value, right? When we measure the height's not good or bad, it just is. And then we put a lens on those things. We say, well, what does the mill think of this? You know, what do caribou think of this or other critters? We're taking off one pair of glasses, we're putting another pair on, and we're looking to see what that value is. That's our job. And there's a lot of values, and these are just some that occur in our forest management plans every day. So, if I deal with those three key things, that's what forest management plans address. These were two I happen to have the pleasure of being a part of for Dachau and our meetings. And those are produced every 10 years for each of the FMAs in the province. There are a couple of kind of key things in there that it's important to kind of latch back to. One is that idea of a gross and net land base. You know, I talk about taking maps and smooshing them together to get some kind of output. And that can be simply something like taking your whole forest, and you take out the watercourse buffers, and you identify what's coniferous. You take out what's not merchantable. Let's say it's never ever going to have enough wood for you, or it's too far away from where you can access it. Those things are called merchantable deletions. So that we end up with a forest that is contributing values, and a forest that, at least from a merchantability standpoint, is not. One thing I think is kind of cool about this example, right, is that's a function of economics. As you know, prices go up and down a little bit, these stands are going to move into and out of productive land base. What I like about that is it really helped me understand the Northern Gateway Pipeline. See, everything comes back to forestry. When they talk about this and they say, okay, we're going to get our oil, our bitumen, however, to tidewater faster, and that's a wonderful thing because it lowers our cost. You know what else it does? You know, Alberta's got a set of resources, energy resources, and our ability to get at them is driven in part by economics. There's stuff there that isn't economic to harvest, right? But with this Northern Gateway Pipeline, lowers that cost, and more of our resources actually become available to us. They become economic to harvest. Just exactly like in that land base. And then, of course, part of that management planning is the yield curves. I've talked about values, and now I just want to talk a bit about how those values work their way into a forest management plan. The CSA standard, I don't really know how much play it's getting as much anymore, right? Companies are kind of coming away from it a bit. I think FSC and SFI are sort of dominating that market. But the CSA standard is based in ISO 14000, and that's still very current, okay? And so this is their way of framing up that idea in ISO 14000 of environmental aspects and indicators and targets. I think I'm making the cameraman guy's day a horrible bit. So this is the way we frame up those values of which we're concerned with. We identify what that value is. We identify an objective for that value. We figure out what's our speedometer, right? What are we using to measure that? That's the indicator. So here's an example. And then we identify our target. What are we aiming for? This is I'm kind of condensing it a bit, but this is an example from the Forest Management Planning Standard. That X%, that's where the juice is, right? That's where things matter. Some kind of key points around how we view, like what we think a void is and how you choose that target. Very rarely does the standard commit you to something specific, right? But we expect you to talk to your stakeholders. We expect you to take social acceptance into account. That's just a function of working with your stakeholders. Sound science, credible analysis. But probably the biggest thing here is those clearly stated value trade-offs. If you're going to say, well, here's what I expect to protect in terms of, for example, old forest, that costs something for other values. This is what's so valuable about this approach, is our ability to analyze those trade-offs and to see what we're giving up in order to get something else. Can't be Alberta unless I at least mention natural disturbance. And it's also coming into the land use framework and regional planning as a whole, right? The integrated resource management system in Alberta. So it's current. And that idea, right, that if we make a landscape look like fire, for example, would have made it look, well, all these critters in the big basket, they got along fine for thousands of years under that natural disturbance regime. They're probably going to be okay. There might be a few, a little more sensitive, We need something special for those. That's where we identify specific habitat requirements. And that's very much the approach the standard takes. And I always like to point out to the fish and wildlife biologists that it was the fish and wildlife guy, this Malcolm Hunter in Maine, who came up with this, right? Because they're not always so convinced of our approach, but it came from one of their own. An important output of that forest management plan is the spatial harvest sequence. So I've talked about how actions create those conditions that drive the values. So this is what that is. This is probably, in my mind, the most important thing that comes out of a forest management plan. Because if we designed it right, then it's producing those values, those targets that we set. But we have to close the loop. So we planned to do something, we've got our spatial harvesting sequence, and now we actually go out and do something, we're actually harvesting. And it's important to create that feedback back into the system. And that would be where we evaluate plan performance. And so in the forest management planning system, that's stewardship reporting every 5 years. And the two most important things that we expect to be reported in the stewardship report are, did you do what you said you were going to do, right? And it's impossible. It's impossible. Just like somebody said earlier, right? Every model is wrong, and so every plan is going to be wrong. But it's important to know how wrong. Because that's what drives whether you met your targets or not. And if you didn't, then you're not going to. That's nature. But it gives us a chance to evaluate what the impacts and consequences of that are. So, when I was asked to give the presentation, I was asked, can you identify a specific part of Alberta where integrated resource planning and forestry works really well? And I sort of declined to do that because, in general, I think we've set up a solid framework across the province for the achievement of that. And probably in some areas they do a little bit better, and in some areas they do a little bit worse. And what I think drives that, is whether, if you're driving a bus, and that bus is full of values, which value are you putting, who's driving that bus? If what's driving it are long-term values and that desire to look out over time and say, what's best for Alberta, or something like that, the bus is probably going to end up somewhere pretty reasonable. But if what's driving it is short-term immediate need, it's like, well, I want to get the biggest wood, I want to get the closest wood, I want it now, then you're less likely to drive that bus somewhere we want it to go. I call it Jesus take the wheel. To contrast all this, right? Because that's pretty complicated stuff, and it's not always easy. I know that we've talked about triad for years, and just like everything else in forestry, these concepts are kind of getting borrowed and moved into resource planning across Alberta. And this one comes in a specific way. So, real quick, intensive, that's where you've got your plantations and essentially, we'll say, unconstrained forestry. Protected, that's where you're saying, well, I'm going to sequester this area off and not touch it. And here's where I'm going to try and do a bit of both, right? Kind of more like we do basically everywhere. This is nice because you have a lot of certainty operating in that zone. And that's sort of where the tension is, I would say, in regional planning right now in Alberta. So on this side, this is where those regional plans, this is where regional plans are setting up to establish. You've probably heard regional plans, and those are frameworks, and those frameworks are going to set triggers, and they're going to set limits. So I talked about indicators. Setting a trigger is saying, whoa, we just went over 100 kilometers an hour, we better slow, manage our speed a little bit because the cops are probably going to be watching us. The limit would be, for me anyway, 110, 120, whoa, we're going to get a ticket for sure. Environmental impact assessments are the tools that system evaluates those things against. And monitoring is just us making sure that it's checking back to see how things worked out. Where the world we live in right now, at least, is we're setting targets. We're looking for desired values, not just what the landscape can tolerate. We're planning for it and we're forecasting. We're looking out ahead to see what's going to happen. Here's the effective difference. If this green line here represents the difference between what's the limit, right, in a framework for some value, let's say footprint. AER is getting project applications, and they're saying, yep, that one's below the limit, good, still below the limit, good, still below the limit, good. These ones are all good because we haven't gone over the limit yet. Oh, these ones are all, can't do them. Sorry, we're over the limit, we're done. Conceivably, this product up here, this project, might have been a lot better than this one down here. Too late, don't know, right? It's sort of a race to the limit. Who can get their project in first and get it over with? Where our approach, the world we live in forestry, and what we might see in sub-regional planning, right? In those places where values, the trade-offs are harsh and it's a contested landscape, you shuffle the deck, right? If someone gives me a card deck and I can go through and pick out, okay, there's my 4 of spades, 5 of spades, 6 of spades, 7 of spades, 8 of spades, straight flush, right? That's planning. That's looking into the deck and figuring out what's best. In one thing, you're considering the projects independently, and the other one, you're considering them as a suite, right? But a little bit from an industry perspective, from probably even a planning perspective, this side's a little bit easier, this side's a little bit harder. You'll be happy to know I think I'm wrapping up. Okay, so I talked a bit about what our approach is and how it leads us to an outcome. And that the 3 main things out of that are what kind of landscape are we starting with, what's our starting picture, how the stands change over time, and what we do to them, what we do to change them, and what they do after that. Good planning, our job is in figuring out, what does society want, what are those values that they've given us responsibility to manage, what are the conditions that produce those values, and then what do we got to do to make them happen, what are the actions we take. So, the long and short of it, the punchline would be, for me, if you define your values up front, then the plan can account for them. You build them in at the front. If you wait until the plan is complete to assess your value, then you have to settle for what you get. And if we don't do the actions we planned, then we can't expect to get the values that we planned for. Thanks so much for your patience. We're done.
Did anyone have any questions for Brendan? Oh, you have one question over here.
Hi, Brendan. Ray Hills. One of the questions I have is kind of a question comment is Alberta sounds like they finally want to do integrated resource planning, which we've talked about for 20 years in the province. One of the things that you didn't touch on is this the notion of tenure. So we have tenure arrangements in the province, vis-a-vis FMAs, quotas, and even mineral rights. And so when we talk about integrated resource planning, the value proposition you talked about there has already been stated, I think, through the tenure, the terms of the tenure that have been established in the province. How do you reconcile integrated resource planning the way you want to do it? Rob Stokes talked a couple weeks ago at the CIF conference in Whitecourt, which is really interesting because, I know what the Forest Matter Planning Standard says, but I know what the framing is in Alberta around tenure. And so how do you take this new approach when you have, I guess you call them legacy documents that have strong relationships to using and rights of companies on that land base with a new way to maybe do business in Alberta?
I was so close. That's
a loaded question.
It's a fantastic question, and so that I understand you. You're asking about sort of my new role in sub-regional planning. How are we going to take an approach that kind of looks like that, but integrates other sectors while respecting the rights of FMA holders that are pre-existing?
Yeah, I mean, you talk about like the values, right? Is what do people want? And Alberta has already said what they want. They want forestry extensively. They want oil and gas extensively. Money has changed hands, and now you have a role, and there's a department that has a role to now do something different. That's a bit of a game changer for a lot of people who have to use that land base. How do you do that?
I'm going to take a shot. I may not be wearing my GOA hat, okay? Because this is still a dark landscape for us. But let me frame it up like this. So yes, you've got that contract, right, with the government. And more than a contract, it's legislative, right? An order in council and an FMA, and it confirms your rights. It requires you to prepare a forest management plan as to meet the standard, and the standard has those voids identified. Here's the problem, I think, that frustrates folks who work in the forest sector in Alberta, is that you designed your plan, let's say, to create or maintain a certain amount of old forest. But there are other players there in the landscape who are preventing you from ever achieving that objective. So that it almost makes it seem, well, it can seem a little pointless. Sorry, my mic's not on. Can you guys hear me okay? Yeah. Okay. What we imagine sub-regional planning doing, and I do mean imagine, right? This is still, we're a brand new branch and we're still kind of figuring this out, is bringing other players to the table who are influencing that landscape and trying to bring them into abiding by those same values that the planning standard already has. I know these planning standards getting a little long in the tooth and it needs an update, but as an approach, right, for identifying some kind of value on the ground and leading to its achievement, if we don't bring those other players to the table somehow, it's all for naught. It's more like that environmental impact assessment idea. We're just racing towards the limit, and then we're done. I think, at least in part, and even if I were only to confine myself to the value of a sustainable flow of timber and maintaining a mill in the community, if we don't bring those other players into that, even that value is potentially sacrificed. I know that's not much of an answer. I appreciate the depth of your question.
Any more questions? Thank you very much. Excellent presentation. So that concludes our speakers for today. We're going to do a few draws because we have quite a few prizes left. Ray Hills. Kevin Wilczak. Les Hell. And the last one, Darren Riddle. Is Darren still here? Okay, he loses his prize. Does anyone know if he's in the bathroom or anything? Oh, Tyler Caddy.
That's wrong.
I think we should redraw that one too.
We do. Take two. That's all you do.
So now our registrar, Chanel Wilkinson, is going to come up and give our closing comments.
Thank you, Jade. So I just had a few thank yous for a few different people today. First and foremost, thank you so much to our presenters and exhibitors for taking time out of their busy schedules to be here to speak to us today. Without them, there really wouldn't be a reason to be here. So thank you very much. A big thanks to our planning committee. Their hard work in helping us put this together and putting the agenda together. Our planning committee this year was Elaine Anderson, Terry Jess, and Chris Jolly. Also a big thank you to our MCJ, who was very good, I thought, if you could with her other profiles as well. And also a very big thank you again to all of our sponsors. Your ongoing support is very much appreciated by the members of the council. On that note, also, I would like to thank the council for all of their support and assistance for this event as well. And finally, thank you to all the attendees who came today. And I hope to see you all at the AGM tomorrow. And just one final note before we close off, there are some posters and sign-up sheets at the back. If anybody is interested in any of the council vacancies for the elections tomorrow or any of the committees that we'll be putting together. There's some information on the walls at the back and some sign-up sheets. If you want more information, you can always talk to myself or one of the council members. And that's everything. Thank you, everyone.